June 14, 1348. Florence. Pietro Vernacci woke up thirsty. He was 17, an apprentice goldsmith. Dreams of opening his own workshop someday. He reached for water and felt it. A lump on his neck. Soft, hot, pulsing. The size of a quail's egg. By noon, it would be the size of an apple. By sunset, black as coal. By midnight, Pietro Vernacci would be dead. He wasn't special. He wasn't the first. And he sure as hell wouldn't be the last. Because on this day, Florence, one of the richest, most powerful cities in Europe, began to die. The bells rang constantly. Not to call the faithful. To count the corpses. In 6 months, 70,000 people would be erased from existence. The streets would run with human waste. Families would abandon their children. Civilization would eat itself alive. This is the day Florence fell to the plague. To understand the horror of what was coming, you first need to understand what Florence was. 1 year before the catastrophe, Florence wasn't just another Italian city-state. It was the financial heart of Europe, home to over 100,000 souls. Florentine bankers financed kings. Their weavers produced the finest fabrics on the continent. Their guilds controlled trade empires stretching from London to Constantinople. The streets were narrow, yes, claustrophobic even by medieval standards, but they overflowed with life. The sound of hammers in goldsmith workshops, the cries of fishmongers at Mercato Vecchio, Latin being recited in universities. The great families, the Medici, the Bardi, the Perizzi built palaces that touched the sky. Artists were beginning to paint with a perspective the world had never seen before. This wasn't the Dark Ages. This was the Renaissance being born. But there was something approaching. Something that traveled faster than any army. More lethal than any sword. And it came on the same ships that brought the spices, the silks, and the gold. October 1347. Port of Messina, Sicily. 12 Genoese galleys dock, arriving from the Black Sea. The sailors are wrong, feverish, delirious, covered in black swellings the size of apples. Some are already dead when the ship docks, their bodies rigid, clutching the oars. Sicilian authorities expel the ships too late. The thing, whatever it was, had already jumped to dry land. And it began to spread. Like fire through dry straw. Spring, 1348. The plague reached the Italian mainland with perfect methodology. First Genoa, then Pisa, then Florence. Nobody knows exactly who the first case was. There were no sophisticated medical records. But we know how it began to spread. The rats. More specifically, the fleas on the rats. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, name that would sound alien to Florentines, lived in the fleas that infested the black rats that lived in the same narrow streets where people slept, ate, and died. The perfect city for a perfect massacre. May 1348. The first symptoms appeared in Florence's port district, where ships from Pisa docked. It started with fever. Then came the headache, a stabbing pain, as if someone were driving nails into your skull. Then, the swellings in the groin, armpits, neck, the size of eggs. Then, the size of apples. Black as charcoal, filled with pus and clotted blood. The surrounding skin would necrotize, turning black, hence the name, Black Death. Florentine doctors had no idea what they were facing. Their theories were as varied as they were useless. Miasma, bad air from swamps, planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, divine punishment for the city's sins, water poisoned by Jews or lepers. The treatments, leeches to balance the humors, burning incense to purify the air, prayer, just prayer. But the plague didn't negotiate. It didn't accept bribes. It didn't care about your last name, your bank account, or how many Hail Marys you recited. It just killed. And in June 1348, Florence realized this wasn't an outbreak. This was an apocalypse. June to October, 1348. The next 5 months would transform Florence into something that barely looked human. Giovanni Boccaccio was there. He survived. And what he wrote in the Decameron is the most brutal account we have. So many bodies were brought to the churches every day that there was not enough consecrated ground to bury them. Enormous pits were dug in the cemeteries, and the corpses that arrived were piled in layers, like goods on a ship. Think about that, bodies, like goods. This wasn't burial. This was disposal. The city began to crumble from the inside out. The doctors died first. Then the priests, those who tried to administer last rites to the dying. Then the gravediggers, the nurses, anyone who touched the infected. Families began to abandon their own members. Boccaccio again. Brother abandoned brother, uncles abandoned nephews, sisters left brothers, and often wives left their husbands. More shocking still, fathers and mothers refused to care for their own children, as though they were strangers. Imagine that. You hear your own parents locking the door from the outside. You're inside, feverish, feeling the buboes growing under your skin. And the last thing you hear is the sound of their boots, walking away on the cobblestone street. That was Florence in 1348. The social order, that fragile construction that keeps civilization functioning. Looters raided the homes of the dead. False doctors sold miracle cures that were just dirty water with herbs. Some began living in constant orgy, believing that extreme pleasure would keep death away. Others flagellated themselves in the squares, whipping their own backs until bones showed, screaming that the end times had arrived. And maybe they were right. Let me tell you about one family. The Alberti family, wool merchants. 3 generations living in one house near Santa Croce. Lorenzo Alberti, the patriarch, his wife, Caterina, their 2 sons, their daughter, Isabella 13 years old, their grandson, Marco just 6 months old. June 18, 1348, Lorenzo comes home from the warehouse with a headache. June 19th, he can't get out of bed. The fever is cooking him from the inside. June 20th, the bubo appears. His wife tries to lance it with a hot knife, like the barber surgeon told her. Lorenzo screams so loud the neighbors can hear it through stone walls. June 21st. Lorenzo is dead. June 22nd, Caterina develops a cough. Then, the fever. June 23rd. Both sons show symptoms. June 24th. Isabella is crying because she can't wake her mother up. June 26th. The entire family is gone. All of them? Except Isabella. She survived, but there was nobody left to take her in. The extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, were either dead or too terrified to open their doors. The last record we have of Isabella Alberti is in a convent ledger from 1349. She was admitted as an orphan. She died 2 years later in childbirth. She was 15. That's what the statistics don't tell you. 70,000 dead isn't a number. It's 70,000 Lorenzos, 70,000 Isabellas, 70,000 individual erasures from history. July 1348, peak of the outbreak. Every day, between 400 and 600 people died per day. The churches stopped ringing bells for the dead. Not out of respect, but because if they rang for everybody, the bells would never stop. The streets were empty. The silence was unnatural. Florence had always been loud, merchants shouting, children playing, carts creaking. Now there was only the wind and the smell. Always the smell. Bodies were left on doorsteps, in gutters, some simply rotted where they fell, because there weren't enough living people to carry them away. Dogs and pigs, which normally lived in the streets, began eating the corpses. Then the dogs and pigs died too. Authorities tried burning bodies in massive bonfires in the open fields. The sky turned black with smoke. At night, you could see the flames from miles away, beacons of death, signaling where civilization had given up. The city's tax records give us the final count. January 1348, before the plague, 120,000 inhabitants. December 1348, after the plague, 50,000 inhabitants. 70,000 dead, nearly 60% of the population. erased in 6 months. For context, that's like New York City losing 5 million people in half a year. October 1348. The plague began to subside. Not because it was defeated, simply because there was nobody left to kill. Florence survived, but the city that emerged from the ashes was fundamentally different. First, the economy. With half the population dead, suddenly there was a shortage of workers. Surviving serfs and peasants realized something revolutionary. They had bargaining power. Wages doubled, tripled. The feudal structures that had governed Europe for centuries began to crack. The rich, those who survived, got even richer. They inherited fortunes from dead relatives, bought properties for pennies. Inequality exploded. But the real change was philosophical. The generation that survived the Black Death didn't believe in the same things anymore. The church had promised divine protection. The church had failed. Doctors had promised cures. Doctors had failed. The old order religion, authority, tradition, all of it had been tested, and it broke. What came next? The Renaissance. Not despite the plague, because of it. The post-plague generation had seen that life was short, brutal, random. So, they stopped waiting for heaven and started building beauty here, now, in paintings, in sculptures, in science. They looked at the human body which they'd seen rot by the thousands, and decided to study it. Leonardo da Vinci dissecting cadavers, Andreas Vesalius revolutionizing anatomy. The scientific method being born from the ashes of medieval mysticism. Here's the line you need to remember. Florence didn't fall to an army. It fell to something you couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't bribe. It fell to a bacterium the size of a thought. And that terrified people more than any sword ever could. The Black Death killed half of Europe, but it also killed the Middle Ages. Today, Florence is beautiful. Tourists take selfies on the Ponte Vecchio, eat gelato in Piazza della Signoria, admire Michelangelo's David. But if you know where to look, the scars are still there. In the cemetery of San Miniato al Monte, there are mass graves that have never been opened. Thousands of bodies still there, 676 years later. In the church of Orsan Michel, there are frescoes of saints who were supposed to protect against the plague. They didn't. And if you walk through the narrow streets of Oltrarno at night, when the tourists are gone, you can still feel not the smell, but the memory of it, the weight of history, the echo of 70,000 screams. March 2020. 672 years after the Black Death, Florence closed its streets again. COVID-19 wasn't the Black Death, not even close. But when Italy went into lockdown, when bodies piled up in Bergamo, when people died alone in hospitals without family, the fear was the same. Italians recognized it immediately. That ancestral terror, that knowledge buried deep in their cultural DNA, that it can all collapse overnight. The Florentines of 1348 would have understood our panic buying, our quarantine fatigue, our conspiracy theories about the virus being engineered, because they did the same things. They just blamed different enemies. We like to think we're different, more advanced. But when the invisible killer comes, we react the same way our ancestors did. We lock our doors. We abandon our sick. We look for someone to blame. We're still medieval. We just have better masks. Here's what 1348 teaches us. Civilization isn't permanent. It's fragile. It can crumble in months. The systems we trust, medicine, government, religion, can fail completely when we need them most. But humanity survives, not because we're strong, but because we're stubborn. Because even after watching half the world die, the survivors woke up the next morning and decided to build something new, something better. Florence fell to the plague in 1348, but it got back up. And in the process, it changed the world forever. The plague didn't end because we beat it. It ended because it ran out of us.